Today is the 15th Monday in August, and I'm speaking with Mr. Tyus Butler of Athens, Georgia. And Mr. Butler, would you share with me a little of your experiences during the World War II era?
Be very glad to. My Army name was Marion T. Butler, but my middle name of Tyus, which is my mother's family name and is the one that I've had before and after the war, but during the war years it was Marion T. Butler. And I got my A.B. degree in journalism from the University of Georgia, and my master's in American history, Southern history primarily, American history at LSU. And then I was working on a PhD at the University of Wisconsin when the draft status came along. In 1942, I had signed up for the V7 program in the Navy, which was a general commission type program given by the Navy. But in the middle of all the planning for that V7 program, all the merchant ships were being shot down or sunk by U-boats, German U-boats. So they said every person in the V7 program would be put in charge of a gun crew aboard merchant ships. I could not pass the eye test for that more demanding service, so I was dropped from the V7 program. And then soon after that, I was drafted from my hometown of Griffin in Spalding County, and that's where my service years began. But I was teaching here at the university just before then, just after receiving my master's from LSU. And I was drafted from Griffin. I went to Fort McPherson for processing, and then went to Camp Croft, Spartanburg, South Carolina, where I was in infantry communications. Primarily, it was operation of a message center. Wireless back in those days, and the Morse code was the main form of communication, unfortunately, and not like it is today. So my basic training was taken in communications, infantry communications. One of the things I learned there, and I stressed to my journalism students in later years, was that it was stressed that you did not write military messages so they could be understood, but you had to write the messages so they could not be misunderstood. And that was a good foundation later for me in teaching journalism here at the University of Georgia. After 5 months of training at Camp Croft, I next was sent to Fort Meade, Maryland for a short stay, and then down to Camp Patrick Henry, as you might guess, in Virginia. And out I went aboard the new troop ship called the USS Anderson. We shipped out the Potomac River, and we went zigzagging across the Atlantic alone. We were not in convoy, but the ship had to change its course every few minutes to distract any U-boats that might be there. But we crossed the Atlantic alone. The most outstanding thing, two things I remember very vividly about the crossing of the Atlantic during wartime. One was that Madeleine Carroll, a very beautiful television star, was aboard ship going over as a volunteer for the Red Cross. And the only problem was she liked to smoke on deck at night, which was certainly a no-no in the middle of the Atlantic, and they had to keep reminding her to stay inside for her smoking. The other thing was that this was a large troop ship, and I was so far down in the hole, and they had abandoned ship drill every day. Well, in the entire crossing, I never got up to the deck before the abandoned ship drill was over with, because it was we were about 6 flights down into the hole of the ship. Anyway, where we were headed was to Oran in North Africa, and the first sight I had of Europe was going through the Straits of Gibraltar and seeing Gibraltar to the left. We landed in Oran, and after several weeks there, the recruits that were being sent to the Fifth Army in Italy, we then went from Oran across the Mediterranean in a British troop ship. Actually, I was aboard any number of types of ships during the war, and the only time I got seasick was going across the Mediterranean in the British troop ship, where I had to sleep in a hammock. And that, as I say, was the only time I was seasick at any time during the war. We landed in Naples, and I will never forget going into the harbor at Naples, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of smokestacks from ships that had been scuttled by the Germans before they left out of Naples. And I really don't know how long those smokestacks stayed there before they were able to get them out, because I came back down from farther up in Italy later on, and many of them were still showing there in the harbor. I spent the winter of 43 and 44 at a dairy farm which was commandeered by the Fifth Army as a replacement depot staging area, and it was a dairy farm that Mussolini's son-in-law owned. I was assigned to that depot there to help in the staging and the processing of troops coming in from the United States or maybe from other places throughout the world. I had a variety of assignments, from clerical to quartermaster's duties, and I wound up helping to run an infirmary, a first aid station, in a medical capacity of which I had no medical knowledge whatsoever, but we had the doctors there to look after that. This location north of Naples was just south of Cassino, and so I was in that area of Italy for much of the activity leading up to the final overrunning of Cassino. 5 months or more, I heard the cannons and the artillery fires night after night after night. We had the only time we had any enemy plane activity was at nighttime. The American Air Force was far superior in number and everything else to the German Luftwaffe at that time, so there was not any air raids, a few but not many, but mainly it was at night when they were out surveying as best they could at night. I'll never forget in May 1944 when they started the final bombardment of Mount Cassino, the abbey there at Cassino. Every make bombing plane available from the British Air Force, the American Air Force and the like, mainly B-17s, B-24s and the like. But the air was so thick for 3 days in a row that the reporters, the war reporters over there, said that the birds had to walk because there wasn't room for them in there. But it was a constant Air Force going over, dropping bombs on casinos. Oddly enough, destroying the casino actually made the Abbey more of a fortress than it was before then. And one of the bloodiest combats of the whole war period, which I did not participate in, but I certainly could hear it, was that of attacking a casino, and the many lives of every group was lost. After the fall of the casino, and later we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the fall of Rome, which I believe was in June. It's been within the past few weeks and a month or two.
I believe it was like June 4th or so?
It was somewhere along there. After the fall of Rome, I remember spending July 4th. It was in there because I spent July 4th in the Eternal City. And Italy, with the British 8th Army and the American 5th Army, it probably was the most polyglot armed services groups there was in the entire war, because there were Americans, there were British and Scottish, there were the French, there was the Free Polish, there was Australians, the New Zealanders, Canadians, Brazil, and from North Africa and India, Gurkhas, Moroccans, Tunisians, Algerians, South Africans, and the like. But I remember being in Rome, I say, on the 4th of July. We had a so-called audience with the Pope, thousands and thousands of troops down, and he was there at the Vatican and gave the so-called audience with the Pope. But the main thing was that you saw among the Allied troops practically every uniform that was in the Allied Army. But another thing I'd like to stress is there's one fighting unit in the Italian campaign that I have admired as much as or more than any other unit I've ever known. And that was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which was the Nisi, the American Japanese, mainly the Japanese from Hawaii and California and the western states. But that unit, the 442nd, was to me the most disciplined and one of the bravest units that was in the Allied forces during World War II. When they were processed, when they came into Italy and were processed, that 442nd Regiment was not short a pocket handkerchief. They were that disciplined. They were not short a pocket handkerchief. A lot of the other units that came into Italy, not a lot of them, but a good many of them, some of the ones that lost, they'd thrown the rifles overboard on the ship, they'd thrown the field pack overboard, and you had to start at the outset and almost re-outfit them in uniforms and rifles and everything else that they needed. But this 442nd unit, as I say, they weren't short a pocket handkerchief.
Was that how you saw them in processing there?
Yes, and they were disciplined right from the very beginning in everything, and they were really disciplined in combat. That was, as I said, that was really one of the finest units I know of. And Italy had a lot of fine divisions, great divisions, the 3rd, the 34th, the 36th, 45th, the 85th, the 92nd, the 10th Mountain Division, and the 36th was the Texas National Guard, and it was decimated at the crossing of the Rapido, and that was just before I got there, so I was not there for that, but the 36th, the Texas National Guard was completely decimated in that crossing of the Rapido River. But the 3rd Division, the 34th, the 36th, the 45th, 85th, 92nd, 10th Mountain Division, that's the one that Dole was in, the 10th Mountain Division. And the Italian campaign, as I say, had many, many brave units. But the one that I liked from the discipline point of view, purely from the discipline point, was that 442nd. As I said, I was there with this depot, the processing unit, during most of the time that I was in Italy, which was it had a lot of good angles for me, because I ran into dozens and dozens and dozens of university alumni, and ones I was at the university with, and some came back, some did not. But after the fall of Rome and then Florence, my unit was transported by LCI, landing craft infantry, these flat-bottom boats. But we went up the Italian coast in close to Livorno in that, and I spent the second winter in the North Apennines, just down below Bologna. And people think of Italy as the land of sunshine, and it is. It's still one of my favorite places. I've been back to Italy 6 or 8 times since then, and enjoy all of them. But in the wintertime, and particularly up in the mountains, it can be very, very bad. And the second winter up in the northern Apennines, we had a flood, maybe not it wasn't as bad as the one at Albany and Maracus and South Georgia. But all the units that were down in a kind of valley, they had all the tents washed away and everything. Fortunately, I was farther up and didn't go through that. But we are now in this rough chronology up into the spring of 1945. And first, I was there in Italy when the Normandy invasion took place. So I was already over there prior to then. But in the spring of 45, some of the high points to me are the things I remember. I remember the day in May when Franklin D. Roosevelt died, and that announcement was made.
How was the announcement made?
Well, it was made in stars and announced in the Stars and Stripes. It was also announced by a loudspeaker there in the camp area, but main distribution of the information about the details was in the Stars and Stripes, the Mediterranean edition or the Italian edition of the Stars and Stripes. One of the things I liked about the Stars and Stripes was that I used to catch rides when they were delivering papers, because they delivered them to posts and camps and units all over the Italian theater. I didn't go with them when they delivered them up close to all the shooting, but the other places I used to ride in the plane with them just to catch a ride, because if you either had that or you rode in these Army 6x6 trucks, and you had to go over mountains. I've been back to Italy since then, and the mountains I had to go over in trucks. You now go through in tunnels in the highways. But as I say, I remember when they announced about the death of Roosevelt. I remember when the announcement came about the dropping of the bombs, the atomic bombs in Japan, but it was very evident then that the end was very much in sight. VE Day was in the spring of 45, and I read in the Stars and Stripes where they were trying to figure out what in the world to do with the thousands and hundreds of thousands and hundreds of thousands of troops. You either had enough points and you went back to the United States, or that you either they were waiting to see whether to send you straight to the Far East from Italy. So, but I read in the Stars and Stripes that they were going to set up 3 university commands. One was at Biarritz in France, and one was in Florence, Italy, and a third, I've forgotten, there were 3 of them. I can't think right now. It may have been part of Germany, over there in the German area, that where many of the troops were located. But anybody they could find an assignment, they were willing to let you transfer. So I asked to be transferred to the University Command in Florence. And I spent the last 6 months of my service in Italy in Florence. My assignment there was the editing of a University Command newspaper, which was printed in English, but was published and printed in an Italian print shop. I think the Italian printers picked up English better than I picked up Italian, but one of my enjoyable experiences was working with the Italian printers in getting out this University Command newspaper, which was printed in English. So my last 6 months were there in Florence, and Florence still is one of my favorite cities of the world. I left that assignment, as I say, in November. I had been interviewed when I was first in Italy. I had been interviewed by a special committee for a direct commission in the Army. It didn't come any of the time during the time I was in Italy, but soon afterwards, after the end of the war, I was given a direct commission of captain in the Army, and I returned to America in November 1945. Came aboard a Liberty ship out of Livorno, Leghorn. Took us a week. A little over, maybe longer than a week, because on the way back I listened on the Armed Services radio to 2 Georgia football games, and I saw Charlie Trippi just Friday night, this past Friday night, and told him, I said, Charlie, coming back from Italy at the end of the war, I heard on Armed Services radio 2 Georgia football games, and you had just returned to the Georgia team at that time. And one of the greatest sights that I've seen in my life was when we pulled into New York Harbor and just laid out at nighttime. And to see the Statue of Liberty there at night, all lit up, after having been over in Italy for 2 a little more years, was one of the greatest sights that I've seen. So after being discharged from the Army at Fort Gordon, I stayed in the Army Reserves, and here in Athens, a group of the recently retired Army officers set up a command and general staff school, which was run here for 20 or 25 years. And I was one of the officers in the command and general staff school until I officially retired in 1973.
Really? So your service, really, you continued in the Army
yes,
at that school?
That's right. I had a total of about 28 years, counting active duty time and the Army Reserve time, too.
Well, I've really never known about that. I moved here in 1984. Can you tell me a little bit about the rest of your service, about that school and some of those
Command and General
World War II?
Command and General Staff School?
Yes, sir.
Well, as you know, every officer who really goes on up the ladder, it's almost necessary for him to be a graduate of the Command and General Staff School, which is held at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But what was done here in Athens and many other places, Atlanta had a command general staff school, one in Augusta, one in Macon, a lot of the others after the war, and as they later pulled them together into smaller units. But we had the Command and General Staff educational program, which the staff met 4 times a month. The students came twice a month. And then every summer, everybody, the students and the staff, had at least 2 weeks of camp. I went to Fort Jackson, to Fort Rucker, to Fort McClellan, to Fort out in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The staff met 4 times a month. Did I say 4 times a month? And the students met twice a month for lessons. They were the regular lessons that you get at the Command and General Staff School at Leavenworth. But this was just kind of like an extension program that you have at the university for courses and the like. But this Command and General Staff School here, as I say, ran about 20 or more years after the war.
Where was it located?
We were in a number of places. Down where the Armory at one time was down where the Federal Building is now, the Robert Stevens Federal Building. At one time we met at the end of Washington Street, which is some big store there now. Mm-hmm. And then there was an armory they built out close to the Athens High School, and now the armory is located over in East Athens, but it was in various places, but it was and they had a regular staff there, a permanent staff, that maintained the building, because it was not only for Command General Staff School, it was for all other reserve units. Transportation, we had a transportation unit here, we had a postal unit. Postal unit was sent just recently, you know, to the Persian Gulf, but it was at various places, and they finally, as I say, built one armory, and that got too small, and they built another one over in East Athens.
How old were your students in Command General Staff School? Were they ROTC students in the college?
No.
Military career?
They were all reserve officers. They were all reserve officers who stayed in the reserves. That's so. Actually, it was almost like a fraternity after being in the reserve with them all those years. And some of the best friends I have are those with whom I've served in this reserve program. But many of them, as I was in school with here at the university, too.
And did you say you taught in the journalism school
Oh yeah,
as well?
I was professor of journalism here for a couple of years before I went in the Army. Then I came back in first part of '46, and I taught journalism for full-time up until 1956. And in 1956, I was made Director of Alumni Relations for the university. And for the next 7 years, I was half-time teaching, half-time Director of University Relations. But 50 and 50 didn't add up to 100. 50 and 50 added up to about 150 or 175. So after doing both of them for 7 years on a kind of a 50-50 basis, I decided that I would just be full-time as Director of Alumni Relations. I still lectured periodically in various courses in the journalism school, but from then on, from '56 on, I have been Director of Alumni Relations. I retired in '85, so.
Wanted to get that in as well.
Yeah.
Can you describe, did you have a specialty within the journalism department?
I taught reporting, law of communications, history of journalism, public opinion, and, well, editing, copywriting, editing, and everything of that sort. Back then, the staff had only about 5 or 6 faculty. Now they got an army over there.
And in alumni relations, can you give me an idea of all the work that must have occupied those many years?
Well, the alumni relations was one of the best assignments I've ever had, because I wound up as close friends and knowing all the power structure throughout the state of Georgia. And the leaders of the state during those early years particularly, all of them became very close friends. But one of the most enjoyable things, I established an alumni tour program. And I guess I've handled 40 or 50 tours to all over the world since then. And it's very, very successful. Claude McBride handles it now, and he has done by far the best job, I think, of any person who's had that position. But I helped establish, I did establish the tour program. I also established the alumni seminar program at the university.
And you retired in '85.
Yeah. I actually retired as director in '83, and then I stayed on 2 more years just as a consultant and this and that and the other, taking it easy, but I retired full-time in '85.
Well, that's almost 10 years ago. That's 9 years ago. What have you been up to the last 9 years?
Well, in '83, the year I retired as a director, we bought my wife and I bought a condominium at Crescent Beach, Florida. And so we spend most of the winter months in Florida. I have 3 sons. One has a printing business. One is a lawyer. He's this law firm, Bowen, Williams, and Levy. It's in Savannah, the one that Uga is involved in. He's a partner in that firm. And my youngest son is a radiologist. But we also bought an apartment in the historic district of Savannah, because we used to visit my son and his family, and they had 1 child, and they had 2 children, then they had 3 children, And when they had 3 children, we decided if the best thing is to buy an apartment down there, then we can visit them, have dinner with them, or so forth, but we can go home and wouldn't be scrunched up. And I still travel. My wife are leaving next Monday and going to London, and we'll be in London and in Europe for about 3 weeks.
That sounds wonderful. Would you tell me your wife's name and her maiden name?
She was Eugenia Walker.
And how did
from
you meet?
Atlanta.
How did you meet?
I went with her roommate during college, and that was just before the war. And the roommate, the one with whom I went, married while I was in Italy. So I married Jean, which was a very, very fortunate thing for me. I was a Phi Delta Theta, she's a Tri Delta. So, and I went over to the Tri Delta house to pick up my date, her roommate, and I remember seeing Jean for the first time there.
Well, to go back to those years, I often ask people about correspondence during the war, and how that must have been.
Well,
can you tell me anything about that?
Well, then practically all the correspondence I did was VE mail, the V mail. Was it VE mail? What was it called? Just a little one thing.
Email?
It was just a single sheet that you wrote on the inside and then folded up, and it went postage free. And so they handed those things out, and practically all the writing, all the correspondence I did was that use, because didn't have time and didn't have stationery or envelopes or anything else. But this was a postage free thing.
Were your letters censored? Did you get censored mail?
Yeah. My mother received a number of letters that had holes all through them. And looking back on it, it wasn't anything.
Well, I often also want to toss out a name or two. Could you tell me, for instance, what you thought of some of the commanding officers? For instance, General Patton. Did you have an opinion of him one way or the other?
Well, I was under General Clarke there in Italy. Patton was a great general. I mean, I'm not one of these who criticize people either way, but he did a good job.
And General Clarke?
Well, actually, General Clarke and some of the generals there, the war should have been won a lot sooner than it was, in my opinion, in Italy. Casino there, that was a French general. I can't think of his name right now, but the French general, if they had followed his advice, in my opinion, Casino would have fallen months ahead of the time that it did. But he was not in command, because it was Montgomery with the 8th Army and Clarke with the 5th Army. But the real what is the one who was with Eisenhower?
Bradley?
Bradley. Now, Bradley, to me, was the soldier's general, and I think one of the finest generals in the World War II.
Do you remember other personalities at the time? Were you able to read anything while you were in the service? Were you able to hear any music or any entertainment at all?
Very little, very little. I read Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes you got just about every day, and they had some excellent correspondents, excellent writers for the Stars and Stripes.
Do you remember one in particular?
I was trying to think. Well,
It's okay if you don't.
What's the one that's the cartoonist?
Bill Malden.
Bill Malden. Yeah, Bill Malden.
Still alive.
Yeah, but the one who was killed later in the Pacific, Ernie Pyle in the Pacific, I believe. Well, he was in Italy for part of the time, and Bill Malden was in Italy, but Stars and Stripes did a good job, and Andy Rooney was on. Well, he was on Stars and Stripes.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your childhood before I bring this to a close, and about where you grew up and where you lived before your education, before World War II. Go on.
I was born in Carrollton, Georgia, and my father died when I was 3 years old. And my mother was from Griffin, so we moved back to Griffin after my father's death, and I grew up in Griffin. But there is a Tyus, Georgia, in Carroll County, which was named for my grandfather, because my grandfather had several farms in Monroe County and Lamar County and Spalding County and one in Carroll County. And he also owned a store, a general store there, and the post office wanted to put a post office there in the store for that area. So there's the Tyus family, which was a prominent family there, and Hiram family. And so they flipped the coin to see whether it'd be named Tyus, Georgia, or Hiram, Georgia, and my grandfather won. But that later was a Hiram, Georgia, too. So, so actually, the names for both the families there. But I grew up in Griffin. Graduated from Griffin High School.
Was that an agricultural region at the time, around Griffin?
Griffin was a big. My grandfather was a cotton broker, cotton warehouse. That's been back when cotton was king, and he owned land, owned farms also. But it was a market center. But Griffin is a textile. It's a textile center. It's a number of Dundee mills, Spalding County mills. There are a lot of mills there. So it's more of a it was more of a textile center than it was agricultural.
Well, let's flash forward a few years. Can you recall for me? You mentioned you may have been in Athens before the outbreak of World War. Can you recall where you were when Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941?
I was driving to Atlanta, and there were 3 or 4 other people in the car with me. Only one I remember one name was Warren Jones, a friend from Griffin. But I was driving. We were driving to Atlanta on Sunday morning when the news came about Pearl Harbor. So I was here in Athens at the time, but I remember driving to Atlanta on a Sunday.
Probably after you'd heard, or just?
No, I heard while on the
car radio.
On the car radio while going between here and there.
Must have been a shock.
Well, it was quite a surprise, but see, many of the ones at the university went right into the Army very soon after that.
Did the population of Athens decrease notably?
The population of the student body decreased tremendously during that period. As I say, I wasn't here all that, but I understood it, and it was the women far outnumbered the men during that period.
Do you recall where you lived during some of those times, either at home or in the barracks? I mean, were there things you particularly missed or lacked or would have wanted?
During the war?
Yeah.
Well, actually, right from the very beginning, I was in barracks the entire time. Barracks or tents, mainly. After I got in Italy, I was in tents most of the time.
My question rambled a little bit. How about before you left home? Where were you living before and after the war?
Oh, when I left Athens to go in the army, I lived next to the Athens Regional Hospital in the Talmadge House, which Miss May Talmadge, Miss Julius Talmadge, and there were 3 or 4 of us, boys who lived there, and so that's where I lived before I left here. When I came back, and when Jean and I got married in September of '46, and we lived in the prefabs because it wasn't any house, any place available whatsoever. So we lived for a year or more in the prefabs over on the South Campus, which are now torn down.
Where were they, and what were they?
You know where Hardman Hall is? It's right back of Hardman Hall in that area through there. Then the first house we owned was on Hope Avenue, which is off South Lumpkin, beyond 5 Points, between there and Alps Road, off to the left. We lived there 2 years. Then I bought a home, 17 Woodlawn, which is right in 5 Points, and we lived there 14 years. And then we built a home. We now live out off the Tallahassee Road on Inverness Road, which, in fact, our home, that area was farmland for Dr. John H.T. McPherson, who was head of political science, who, as I say, taught at the university. He bought a lot of farmland out there, old cotton land, and his 2 sons, John McPherson, who was a surgeon until he retired, and Bob McPherson, who later was head of the history department at the university, they owned that land and they wanted to develop it. So we were very good friends with them, particularly John and Helen McPherson, and we built there and moved into the house out there 30 years ago, 1st of April. We moved in on the 1st day of April, 1964. So we've been out there in that area for 30 years.
I'd like to ask you another nitpicky question about the World War II era, about food. Do you remember food in the service, or?
Oh yes. Frankly, I can't complain. I don't think anybody who went to Europe, went anywhere in the war and came back has a basis of any real arguments. I was never sick a day. The only time I was in the hospital, I had to have a plantar wart, P-L-A-N-T-A-R, plantar wart cut out of the bottom of my foot. And the doctor, I was talking with the doctor who cut it out, and he was from Carrollton, Georgia. But that was in a field hospital in Italy. But the food, it was Army food, but Can
you give me a hint of what Army food meant at that time?
Well, it meant powdered eggs, it meant Spam, it meant beans and beans and beans. But they had a lot of good cooks, and they got a lot of good bakers, and so as I say, I don't have any complaint with the food.
Did you ever see British Army over there in those years?
Yeah. I never was with them. I saw them all the time, but because of the 8th Army was there.
Any impressions?
Well, I'm very fond of the British. In fact, say we go into London next Monday. But the British are good. They were good troops.
Did you have an opinion one way or the other of General Montgomery?
Well, the only impression I have was that he had a lot of self-importance. Now, that's purely my opinion. Whether it's justified or not, I don't know. But a lot of the American generals didn't seem to get along with him too much.
Did you, when Roosevelt died, did you know who Harry Truman was at that time?
Yes, I knew that he was vice president, but I didn't know much about him. We haven't had many good presidents since Truman.
You've got a point. Well, upon returning to this country, do you recall being dismissed? Do you recall how your return home went?
Oh yes, yes. When we landed in New York, disembarked in New York, we were transported to the Carlisle barracks. And I will always remember the first thing I did, as soon as I had a free time, I went to the phone and called my mother in Griffin to tell her that I was back in the United States. And we stayed in Carlisle barracks 2 or 3 days. And then we had to ride the train from there all the way down to Augusta, Georgia. And I was discharged in Augusta at Fort Gordon.
And how did you get from Augusta back to here?
Rode the bus.
Mm-hmm. Greyhound? Trailways?
I think so. I think it was Greyhound, but I frankly don't know right now.
Where were the bus stations in those days?
Well, I think the bus station here is the same place it's always been. In my recollection, it seems like it's been 100 years. They need a new one if they can get the bus company back in good financial standing.
Well, my gosh, I've enjoyed talking with you. I often end these interviews by asking people if you were speaking to an audience, college age, people who were learning about World War II as history and didn't remember it through personal experience, is there something you would have them remember most?
Well, first, I think they should know the sacrifices that were made. The sacrifices particularly by the soldiers, and particularly in sailors and Air Force and all of them, and especially by those who killed or wounded and the like. But they should also remember the sacrifices that were made back here in the United States. What won the war, to me, is the industrial might of the United States in providing the tanks and the planes and the trucks and the jeeps and everything else during the war. I think it was the industrial might of this country that made the difference. But another thing is, war is never glamorous. It's never glamorous. That landing, I was not there for the landing at Salerno, but it's a wonder. It's a wonder the American Army stayed there because of all the mess-ups that took place. Based on what I've read, that's all I know. But I've read a good bit. But everybody owes a lot to the ones who served, but they owe even more to those who lost their life and wounded and the like.
Well, thank you for speaking with me today, Mr. Butler.
Good. All right. Enjoy it.